Good afternoon. Welcome to another short story time theater with William Baxter. That's me. This afternoon's story from my book, Web Tales, is entitled A Colorado Springs Tall Tale. I live in Colorado Springs. And this is my take on the Paul Bunyan legend. A Colorado Springs Tall Tale. In 1834, in the city of Bangor, Maine, a giant baby appeared out of nowhere. None of the citizens of Bangor knew how such a giant baby came into existence. But the town folk raised the giant baby until he became a man. The town folk named him Paul Bunyan. A lot of the men in Bangor at times were lumberjacks, and so Paul Bunyan had a desire to become a top-notch lumberjack himself, which he eventually did. Finally, on Paul's 21st birthday, he had grown into a giant of a man who was well over 60 feet high. It was time for Paul Bunyan to leave his friends and adopted family in Bangor and make his own way in life. The townsfolk that raised him presented him with a birthday present, which was a huge double-bladed axe, which was much too big for any ordinary sized man to handle. Paul Bunyan waved goodbye to his friends and made his way west through the dense forest, chopping down trees as he went, making room for people to move west and settle into new homes. When Paul Bunyan made his way to Michigan, the worst and coldest winter in history hit the land with great fury. The winter was so cold, the snow was blue, not white. The blue snowflakes fell from the sky. This winter became known as the Winter of the Blue Snow. While Paul Bunyan fought his way through the heavy blue snow, he found an ox which was lying in the blue snow and was half froze. The creature was so frozen the ox's fur had taken on the color of blue, just like the blue snow. Paul Bunyan breathed life back into the blue ox and promised the creature that he would take care of the blue ox from then on. Paul Bunyan named the blue ox Babe. Babe the blue ox became Paul Bunyan's lifelong companion and developed a huge appetite just like his master. So Babe the blue ox eventually grew into a giant just like Paul. Paul Bunyan started up his own lumberjack camp and hired several lumberjacks. In order for the lumberjack cook, Hot Biscuit Sally, to keep Paul Bunyan and his men fed so they could do their work of clearing out trees for settlers moving west from the east, 100 steel plows were melted down into a giant griddle, which was put over a big fiery crater. Several of Paul Bunyan's men skated around the giant griddle with bacon grease boots, along with Hot Biscuit Sally, who skated all over the griddle, flipping hot cakes 6 ways to New Year's Day. Paul Bunyan and his men received government contracts from the U.S. government to clear out trees throughout the land so that people migrating west could settle into new homes on the American frontier. After many years of hard work, Paul Bunyan and his men had cleared several territories on the frontier, including the Dakotas, which was their most difficult assignment. As Paul Bunyan and his men chopped down the trees, Babe the Blue Ox hauled them off by the thousands to the nearest lumber mills, where boards were manufactured so that houses could be built out on the frontier. One day, Paul Bunyan wanted to look over all the progress he and his men had made throughout the American frontier the last several years. As he and Babe migrated southwest down into what is now Colorado, he decided to construct a giant stepping stool so he could step up to the top of the stool and get a good bird's eye view of the progress that he and his men had made. Paul Bunyan hitched a giant wagon up to Babe the Blue Ox, and the two of them made their way down to the Painted Desert, which is now Arizona. Paul gathered up a lot of big rocks and boulders and loaded them in the giant wagon. Then the two giants headed back to the spot where Paul wanted to construct his stepping stool. The weight of the rocks and boulders in the wagon was so great, even Babe had a rough time pulling the wagon. The sharp wagon hitch dug into the ground in the Painted Desert, digging out the Grand Canyon. Finally, Paul and Babe got back to the spot where the lumberjack wanted to construct his stepping stool. While his men were off on a much earned vacation enjoying themselves, Paul began to unload the wagon, and he began to pile the rocks and boulders from the Painted Desert high, one on top of the other. Paul stepped up to the top of his new stool and saw the great progress he, the Blue Ox, and all of his men had made clearing out the frontier during the last several years, and he was very pleased. While Paul and Babe were gathering rocks and boulders in the Painted Desert, some of those were bright orange and red ones. These rocks were so beautiful to Paul, he just couldn't use any of them to construct his stepping stool, so he piled these shiny red and orange rocks in a separate pile a few miles away from his stepping stool, hoping that some day people would travel there to see these beautiful rocks. And they did, and they became known as Garden of the Gods. Every year after that, Paul and Babe would return to that place so the giant lumberjack could check out the progress he and his men were making. In later years, after Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox went up to Alaska, gold was discovered around there. Paul Bunyan constructed his stepping stool. Soon many pioneers began to settle there, and in the year 1886, the town of Colorado Springs, Colorado, was established. As for Paul's stepping stool, some people got the idea of naming it after the famous military leader and explorer Zebulon Pike. That's the story of how Pike's Peak came into existence. The end. I hope you all enjoyed this afternoon's story, and you all have a good afternoon and evening. Goodbye.